The North Vietnamese Army put a bounty on his head, $10,000, nearly $70,000 today, to anyone who could kill one American soldier, not a general, not a pilot, one Green Beret, who walked into the jungle so many times that Radio Hanoi gave him a name of his own, Mad Dog. He carried 6 pistols on his body at once. A sawed-off shotgun under one arm, a submachine gun under his pillow when he slept, if he slept at all, and when his own team radioed in terror that they were surrounded by enemy soldiers on every side, he keyed the mic back and said the calmest, most terrifying sentence in the history of that war. No, no, I've got him right where I want him, surrounded from the inside. Then on April 24, 1969, he walked into the jungles of Cambodia one last time, and the jungle never gave him back. Before we go any further, if stories like this are the reason you're on this channel, hit subscribe right now, because the War Files exists to dig up the soldiers history tried to erase. This one isn't for the faint of heart. Turn it up and stay to the end, because what happened to this man in his final 20 minutes on Earth still doesn't have a full answer. Jerry Michael Shriver was born on September 24, 1941, in DeFuniak Springs, a small, sleepy resort town in the Florida Panhandle built around a spring, fed lake and not much else. His father was a Korean War veteran, and the house he grew up in ran on discipline, not affection. There was no room in it for excuses, and very little room in it for softness. Jerry was the kind of child adults describe carefully, almost cautiously, when you ask them about him decades later. Not troubled, not loud, just quiet in a way that made people uneasy, because you could never quite tell what was going on behind his eyes. He wasn't the class clown, wasn't the star athlete, wasn't the boy voted most likely to do anything in particular. He was the boy who watched, who listened more than he spoke, who seemed, even as a kid, to be sizing up every room he walked into. Somewhere along the way his family moved out west to Sacramento, California, and it was there, as little more than a teenager, that Jerry Shriver walked into an Army recruiting office and signed away the next several years of his life. Nobody who knew him remembers him explaining why. He didn't announce it at the dinner table. He didn't debate it with friends. He simply left, the way he seemed to do everything, quietly, completely, without looking back. What almost nobody knows, because almost nothing about his early military years survived into the public record, is that before Vietnam ever entered the picture, Shriver had already been tested and retested. He went through jump school and learned to throw himself out of aircraft in the dark. He did a short stretch with the legendary 101st Airborne Division. And then, still barely into his 20s, he earned the Green Beret, the mark of America's most elite unconventional soldiers, a badge fewer than half the men who attempted ever actually receive. And then, just as quickly as he'd appeared on any roster, he vanished from the record again. No headlines, no promotions announced in hometown papers, no photographs sent home for the family album, just silence and training and more silence. That pattern, appear, disappear, say nothing, would define the rest of his short, violent life. By the time the United States committed massive numbers of troops to Vietnam in the mid-1960s, Jerry Shriver was no green recruit stepping off a plane into chaos for the first time. He had already spent years being deliberately shaped into something else entirely. Something the Army doesn't build quickly, and doesn't build by accident. He trained in jungle warfare in environments designed to break men who thought they were ready. He worked through cold weather and mountain exercises far from anything resembling Southeast Asia, learning that terrain, not the enemy, is usually a soldier's first opponent. He picked up fragments of Vietnamese, Lao, and French, enough to read a country before he'd ever set foot in it, enough to understand orders shouted at him in a language most Americans in-country couldn't parse at all. In 1966, Shriver landed in South Vietnam and was funneled into the most secretive, most lethal organization most Americans have still never heard of, MACV-SOG. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. The name was a lie by design, a bland administrative title bolted onto something that had almost nothing to do with studying anything. SOG was America's deep cover machine. Small teams of Green Berets and local tribal fighters were sent across borders the United States government publicly denied crossing, into Laos and Cambodia, hunting the supply lines feeding the entire North Vietnamese war effort along what the world would come to know as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If you were captured on a SOG mission, there was no rescue coming. No official record that you were even there. You were, on paper, a man who did not exist, operating in a country the war wasn't supposed to have reached. Men who signed up for SOG understood, on some level, that they were agreeing to become unpersons the moment something went wrong. Shriver didn't flinch from that reality. He ran toward it. Stationed out of command and control south near Ban My Thuot in the Central Highlands, he became a recon team leader. The man responsible for slipping a handful of soldiers past thousands of enemy troops, gathering intelligence no satellite or aircraft could get, planting explosives on supply depots, calling in devastating airstrikes on targets his own eyes had confirmed, and then somehow getting everyone out alive before the jungle closed back in around them. His teams were built around Montagnard tribesmen, the indigenous fighters of Vietnam's Central Highlands, men Shriver came to respect so deeply that he was known to hand over his own pay and his own supplies to their villages. In a war where most American soldiers experienced Vietnam as something foreign, confusing, and hostile, Shriver seemed to see people worth protecting, and a way of life worth understanding rather than simply passing through. But in the field, something in him sharpened into pure, cold instinct. He didn't sit at base waiting for orders to come down from above. He volunteered, repeatedly, deliberately, for the missions other men dreaded most, the multi-day patrols deep into hostile territory with no resupply, no guaranteed extraction, and no room for a single wrong step in triple canopy jungle where the enemy could be 20 feet away and completely invisible. While most soldiers counted down the days on a calendar until they could rotate home, Shriver was already counting down to his next insertion. Word travels fast in war, even across enemy lines, even through jungle that seems to swallow every signal sent through it. And somewhere along the way, North Vietnamese radio propaganda, the infamous broadcasts American troops nicknamed Hanoi Hana, started warning their own soldiers about an American who moved differently than the rest. They gave him a name meant to frighten their troops into caution before they ever crossed his path, Mad Dog. It backfired completely. American Green Berets adopted the name like a badge of honor, and it stuck to him for the rest of his life. He armed himself like no one else in his unit, and the sheer volume of it became part of the legend on its own. Multiple handguns strapped across his body at once. A sawed-off shotgun for the brutal, split-second violence of jungle ambushes where there was no time to aim, only time to react. Extra ammunition and explosives so his team never had to rely on resupply that might never arrive in time. He modified his own gear constantly and obsessively, cutting weight wherever he could, adding firepower wherever he couldn't, treating every single ounce he carried into the jungle as a decision that could mean the difference between his team walking out or not walking out at all. By his third tour, the man behind the legend was visibly changing, and the men closest to him noticed it even if they didn't say so out loud. He drank more than he used to. He barely slept, and when he did, he reportedly kept a suppressed submachine gun under his pillow, as if some part of him never fully believed the war was outside the wire. Medal of Honor recipient Jim Fleming, who served alongside him, later described Shriver in words that have followed him ever since: the quintessential warrior loner. Antisocial. Consumed entirely by the job. Always training even when there was nothing left to train for. Fleming would go on to say that fighting beside Shriver changed something in him permanently. That for the rest of his life, he'd think twice before crossing a stranger in a bar. Because he'd seen firsthand, up close, exactly what a man like that was capable of when pushed. This wasn't a soldier simply doing a job and counting the days until he could go home to forget it. This was a man who had, somewhere out there in those jungles, stopped separating himself from the war at all. The story that cemented Shriver's legend inside SOG happened on a mission when his small Recon team found themselves encircled by a far larger North Vietnamese force. The exact nightmare scenario every Recon soldier trained obsessively to avoid and dreaded above almost anything else in the field. Radio traffic from teams caught in that position was usually panicked, clipped, desperate, men trying to keep their voices steady while calling in coordinates they weren't sure they'd survive to hear confirmed. Shriver's wasn't. When his superiors radioed in, bracing themselves for a crisis unfolding in real time, Shriver came back on the line almost amused, almost relaxed, like a man reporting mildly interesting weather. He told them not to worry. The enemy hadn't trapped him. He'd trapped them. He had them, in his own words, surrounded from the inside. It sounds like something scripted for a movie. It isn't. It's on record because the men who heard it over the radio that day never forgot it, and repeated it for years afterward almost like scripture. That single call spread through the Special Forces community faster than any award citation ever could, because it captured something true about who Shriver had become by that point in the war. Where other men, good men, brave men, saw an ambush closing in around them, Shriver saw an opportunity closing in on someone else instead. Across his tours, that same nerve earned him the Silver Star, twice, along with the Soldier's Medal, the Bronze Star 7 separate times, the Purple Heart, the Army Commendation Medal 3 times over, and the Air Medal. Any one of those would define most military careers on its own. He rarely spoke about any of them, and rarely wore the ribbons unless regulations forced his hand. Ceremonies weren't the point as far as he was concerned. The next mission was, by the spring of 1969, American intelligence believed they had located something enormous, a major North Vietnamese command and logistics hub tucked across the border inside Cambodia, feeding men, weapons, and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the war raging in the south. Striking it meant crossing a line the United States government wasn't supposed to cross at all, into territory believed to be defended by a force far larger than any single recon team could realistically survive contact with. Jerry Shriver volunteered before anyone even had to ask him twice. On the morning of April 24, 1969, his platoon was air assaulted by helicopter into Cambodia near the town of Memot. The landing zone was hostile before their boots ever touched the ground. Concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire had the clearing covered from multiple directions, positioned and waiting, as if someone already knew they were coming. Within moments of insertion, a machine gun position pinned his men down flat, and Shriver was already on the radio, calling for anything that could relieve the pressure crushing his soldiers, directing fire from position to position, holding his team together under a volume of incoming rounds that should have broken any formation instantly. And then, in the chaos of that firefight, the radio traffic that had carried Jerry Shriver's voice through hundreds of missions, through years of close calls other men didn't walk away from, simply stopped. When reinforcements and search efforts finally pushed into the area afterward, there was nothing left to find. No body, no gear. No confirmed trace of what had happened to the man who, minutes earlier, had been directing the entire fight from its center. The jungle that had made him a legend for 3 straight years appeared to have taken him back into itself completely, without leaving so much as a boot print behind. For years afterward, Jerry Shriver's name sat on the missing, in action lists, one name among thousands of American families who were told nothing certain. Not that he was dead, not that he was alive, only that he was gone, and that gone was the only word the military could officially offer them. Fragmented reports trickled in over the following years from informants and released prisoners, describing tall Americans held under heavy guard in camps scattered across Laos and Cambodia. Some analysts and some family members alike believed one of them had to be Shriver. His height, his build, his known habit of staying silent for long stretches, all of it lined up just enough to keep hope alive and just short enough to prove anything. Nothing was ever confirmed. No photographs surfaced. No verified sighting held up under scrutiny. No proof strong enough to close the case, and none weak enough to let his family simply let it go. For 5 years, his name stayed open on official government lists, was raised repeatedly in congressional hearings, and was whispered about at veteran reunions by men who had served beside him and simply refused to accept that someone like Jerry Shriver could cease to exist without leaving some kind of trace behind him. Finally, on June 10, 1974, the United States Army made it official. Jerry Michael Shriver was declared presumptively dead, not confirmed, not recovered. Declared, a legal and administrative closing of a case that, in every human sense that mattered, had never actually closed at all. No remains were ever found. No grave exists anywhere with his body inside it. His name is carved instead into the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Panel 260W, line 41, a name with no body beneath it, permanently unfinished, the way the man himself always seemed to be. There's a reason the men of MACV-SOG still talk about Jerry Shriver the way people talk about ghost stories decades later. Not because there was anything supernatural about him, but because everything about him defies the ordinary shape of a war story. A quiet, disciplined kid from a small Florida town, raised on discipline and very little else, who grew into the one American soldier the North Vietnamese Army feared enough to put an actual price on his head. A man so calm under fire that being surrounded on every side read to him less like a trap closing shut, and more like an opportunity opening up for someone else to make the first mistake. He never asked to be remembered. He asked, again and again, for the next mission. And in the end, the jungle he had mastered for 3 straight years took him, without leaving so much as a single answer behind for the people who loved him. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the names that never made it into the textbooks, the soldiers who disappeared into the parts of the war nobody wanted to talk about out loud, subscribe to the War Files, and let us know in the comments which forgotten soldier we should dig up next.